Can everybody hear me now? All right. What I was saying to myself was I think a lot of the information in this module is going to be familiar. It consists of a lot of talking points that we've already discussed as sort of asides and expansions on information in previous modules. So I'll try to make up some of the time that I took this morning. So the objective of this module is to sort of outline security requirements that you would have to satisfy if you were shipping from the U.S. to an international destination for nuclear and radioactive materials and involving all modes of transport, imports, exports, and transshipments. So again, we're reaching the top of our toolbox. It's rapidly filling. So shipments of nuclear material made into or out of or through the United States, then obviously you may be facing security requirements beyond those which would be strictly applicable for domestic U.S. transport. For example, a shipment between the United States and Canada involving any modes of transport, Canadian regulations would apply, and there are differences between U.S. and Canadian regulations for nuclear materials and radioactive materials. Similarly, for a shipment from the U.S. to the European Union country, obviously you're going to be involved in multimodal transport, and the shipment in the European Union and other countries, as we saw beyond just the EU, would have to comply with the road requirements of the ADR, the rail requirements of the RID, the maritime requirements of the ADN, and then again, IMO, IMDG, if you're transporting by ocean, ICAO and IATA by air. Threat levels may be different in different countries. This is where, again, we're considering different countries, the competent authorities and regulators may have different status of threat based on intelligence that they're getting from their intelligence services. If they're aware of some higher or reason to have a higher security posture in one country or another, then there might be additional requirements imposed by the competent authority if you're moving material through that country. So again, the idea is when undertaking an international shipment, all the stakeholders need to be aware that there may be different regulatory regimes that are applied as you're transiting different countries. And so these slides are meant to present sort of some examples to kind of walk through the ideas there. So general guidelines for international shipments of nuclear and radioactive materials. As we talked about earlier, IAEA for radioactive materials has provided NSS 9 and NSS 14, which recommend the application of the relevant international modal regulations, the ICAO technical instructions, the IATA dangerous goods regulations, the IMO International Maritime Dangerous Goods Code, the ISPS code for ships and port safe security, ADR, road transport in Europe, ADN, maritime transport in Europe, and RID, rail transport in Europe. In addition, NNS 14 recommends shippers and carriers ensure in advance of the shipment that state variations in the security requirements are applied. And moving through Europe can mean a lot of different states could be involved. And to establish clearly what point responsibility for security is transferred between entities. NSS 13 makes similar recommendations for international transport of nuclear material. So just an example, high-level example of international transport security measures when threat levels vary by countries. If we had a shipment, 40 terabecquerels of cobalt-60 in a single type B package, we're shipping it from the U.S. to an international airport by road, then transported by air to France, and then from France by road through Belgium to Germany. For some reason, we didn't ship directly to Germany. And assuming that for various potential reasons, the federal governments of these countries have assumed different security postures. The United States and France have a normal threat level. Belgium has a high threat level. Germany has a medium threat level. For some reason, Belgium's government could be spun up about something. They've got some intelligence, some reason to believe that there's a higher risk at this point in time. Maybe there's some indications that Greenpeace wants to demonstrate. Who knows? So what security issues should be considered? The categorization and resulting security measures imposed for each segment of the transport, and the potential need to upgrade security measures based on threat levels for each segment of transport. Now, I want to try to get through these quickly, but as an aside, my personal experience, I'm not an expert in Belgian regulations. I'm not an expert in German regulations. I'm not even an expert in French regulations. As a shipper, or even just a forwarder, if I have a customer in the US who's trying to ship internationally, I'm not going to pretend that I have all of that information. I'm going to indicate my intention and my plans to work with an agent, a forwarder in France or Belgium and Germany to make sure that all those points are covered. We do this very routinely. If I'm shipping material from the US to France, I'm working with my Arriva-TN counterparts in France. When we ship through Belgium, we ship into Antwerp all the time because that's where the ocean carriers go. We work with Transrad, technically a competitor. Often in Germany, we'll work with NCS, a competing company. But we work with them because they're the domestic experts for those countries. Your attitude as a shipper should be the same, that you're not necessarily going one-stop shopping and you're not necessarily responsible to know all this on your own by yourself. But as a summary, what are we going to be looking at moving this material? In the United States, we've got a normal threat level we've established, but the material categorization, it's a Category 1 quantity of radioactive material, regulated under 10 CFR 37, as we've already discussed. Particular actions to accommodate the threat level, none, we're normal. And just note that the basic requirements that we've talked about are higher relative to the requirements imposed by the regulations of other countries. Transport by air to France, in the international regulations, this would be considered a high consequence radioactive material. The ICAO technical instructions, IATA dangerous goods regulations would apply. Again, normal threat level, we're not going to apply any additional actions. France by road, similarly, high consequence dangerous goods, ADR applies. Transport by road, no additional requirements in France or actions in France. In Belgium, however, for this example, the Belgian government has established that there's a high threat level. We're going to be complying with the ADR European Agreement for road transport, but we're going to interface with the Belgian regulator, the competent authority and other regulators in Belgium to understand what this threat they perceive is and work with them to determine what do we need to do to mitigate that additional threat. I can't tell you all you have to do is A, B, and C. It depends on the threat, but you have to interface with the stakeholder, you have to interface with the regulator to understand what that elevated threat is, what the implications are, and mitigate it. You might also be told, look, you probably shouldn't even be doing this shipment at this time. Or if you're going to do it, maybe you should consider avoiding Belgium. We've had recently, for example, this past spring actually, there was an Atlantic container line vessel 3,000 TEU vessel delivering to Hamburg, port of Hamburg in Germany. And a fire broke out on the vessel. And it had a container of empty UX-30 packages that are used to transport enriched UF6. So it's UN 2908, empty packages, not a real severe hazard. But of course, as the gentleman before me pointed out, anytime there's any sort of an event like this that involves hazardous material, radioactive material, it becomes a media event. Then, so we dealt with that, but then Hamburg, the port was closed. So we had shipments, active shipments that we were planning to send through Hamburg. We had to react by coordinating with our affiliated company in France, with our contracted partners in other countries in Europe, figure out, okay, what do we do? How do we divert these loads that we've already got going? Can we get them into Belgium? What do we need to do to make sure that we can discharge in Antwerp? Make sure that we meet all the Belgian requirements. We work with Transrad, a company in Belgium, to make sure that we had the proper permits in place, that we established. We had to get the right, we had to modify our road transit permits in Germany to indicate that we're now coming from Belgium. So we had to react on the fly for a lot of these shipments, but the port was closed for reasons determined by the Port Authority and the government in Germany, and we had to react to that. The shipper, I don't want to say was blissfully unaware. We informed them of everything, but it was our responsibility to handle it and figure it all out and make sure that the shipment still happened the way they wanted it to. And it would have been really difficult for Areva NP in Richland, the fuel fabrication plant, to figure all that stuff out. So again, what I'm trying to relate to you is it's important that everyone who's a shipper knows this stuff, but you're not necessarily going to be able to figure all this out on your own. I can't figure it all out on my own. We have to have help in those countries. International transport security measures for spent nuclear fuel. If we're shipping spent fuel into or out or from the United States, I don't know how often we ship spent fuel out of the U.S., but consignors and carriers have to be aware the international security requirements, like we've talked about, could be different. Domestically, 10 CFR 73 applies. And as we've discussed, there's a separate set of requirements specifically for irradiated nuclear fuel, spent nuclear fuel. But internationally, there could be a variety of, or various levels of security requirements applied, and as determined by the states. So, requirements for each country involved in a shipment of spent fuel should be defined before the transport shipping plan is developed. The idea, again, is that in the planning process, you establish which countries you're going to be transiting, what their particular requirements are, what needs to be taken into account, what actions need to be performed to satisfy those requirements. If we had a shipment coming from France going to the U.S., or we were planning a shipment from, we did a shipment from Portugal a couple years ago. We're planning one from Switzerland. The level of security requirements that are going to be applied in Europe, they're going to be different than here in the U.S. That's okay. It's not wrong. But there needs to be taken into account in your planning and understood what's going to be happening on the foreign country as opposed to what's going to be happening in the U.S. Potential transport security requirements for international shipments of radioactive materials. Again, we'll need to verify what security measures are required for each country. Most countries are party to the Chicago and Solis Convention, so the ICAO technical instructions and IMO, IMDG code and the ISPS codes will be applied. Again, commercial airlines, the IATA dangerous goods regulations are essentially an extension of the ICAO technical instructions. All members of the countries of the EU will be applying the ADR, ADN, and RID regulations. And as discussed, there's countries outside of the EU that also apply these regulations. They all apply the recommendations of the UN model regulations for all radioactive materials except for those accepted packages. Consigners have to apply security requirements commensurate with the individual's responsibilities, use only carriers that have been appropriately identified, properly secure transit sites, provide security awareness training to all involved personnel. In addition, for the high consequence radioactive materials greater than 3,000 A2, the competent authorities may establish a consignor or carrier identification program. Operators need to develop and implement a transport security plan applicable to those involved in the transport of the material. And consignees need to apply the international mode and material specific requirements and any additional national requirements. For road, rail, and inland waterway, crew members have a means of identification. Vehicles and freight containers undergo security inspections. Use transport, telemetry, or tracking, and the road and rail vehicles and craft can be fitted with devices or equipment to harden and prevent theft. So, as we've talked about, for radioactive sources, many countries have agreed to abide by the recommendations of the IAEA Code of Conduct and the Safety and Security of Radioactive Sources, which addresses 25 radionuclides and emphasizes the need to maintain continuity of control during international transport. NSS 9 recommends that 10D level be the threshold beyond which enhanced security level measures are applied. And as specified in the UN model regulations, that 10D threshold is used for high activity radioactive material for those 25 nuclides. In contrast, the NRC regulations has a shorter list. 15 radionuclides are specified in 10 CFR 37 with divisions into Category 1 or Category 2 based on the thresholds. And calls them Category 1 and Category 2 quantity, radioactive material quantities of concern. It establishes those two threshold levels, whereas NSS 9 has just one threshold level. So again, when you're involved in international shipments, you have to be aware that the same quantity of material moving from Europe to the US, for example, in Europe, there might be a certain level of requirements that are applied, and when you get to the US, you might have to apply a higher level of requirements. And vice versa. You could ship something out of the US that's a Category 1 quantity of radioactive material, and you might be applying a higher level of security and physical protection requirements than are going to be applied when the shipment gets to Europe.
Mike, the first two sub-bullets up there, it's a Category 1 and 2 quantities of radioactive material, and then Category 1 and 2 RAM-Q. Are they the same thing?
Actually, I think there's a typo on the slide here. I think this should just say that the new NRC order.
But the two
because this is where the confusion lies.
terms that are in quotes and in
Right.
two letters, are those two terms equivalent to each other?
They're supposed to be, and that's the problem.
It's not a typo because 10 CFR 73 has an appendix at the back.
Ah, yeah, you're right. This is the crux of the problem. I'm sorry, I suffered a little dyslexia there for a second. 10 CFR 37 was an entirely new section of the Code of Federal Regulations that was issued this year for physical protection of byproduct material, and what the NRC was trying to do is take what had been transmitted as orders to all of these entities that have radioactive sources for radiators and other devices. All the requirements that they had created as interim compensatory measures post 9/11 and put them into the Code of Federal Regulations. And in the Code of Federal Regulations, they defined Category 1 and Category 2 quantities of radioactive material. The problem is that in 10 CFR 73, and I think also in DOT regulations, there still exists this term, Category 1, Category 2, radioactive materials quantities of concern, RAMQC. So they created the new set of regulations in 10 CFR 37. They came up with a slightly different term, and they didn't change 10 CFR 73. They didn't change the term in 10 CFR 73. And they haven't changed the term in where it shows up elsewhere in, I think there's an instance in the DOT regulations. And so I believe the reason why they issued this order in October was to say, whoops, yeah, RAMQC, it's also all the same regulations apply for Category 1 and Category 2 quantities, radioactive materials quantities of concern. It's, if you look at the order and you look at 10 CFR 37, the requirements are identical. It's just one's talking about Category 1 and Category 2 quantity of radioactive material, and the other one's talking about RAMQC.
Different labels for the same thing,
Yep,
basically.
yep.
Okay.
We've talked about a lot of this already, and I've gone over time again, I think. So just to run through real quick, NSS 9, the requirements, a summary of the requirements for basic security level, enhanced security level, additional security measures. You can go through this in your books just to see that, again, there's a graded approach. Similarly, for requirements of international shipments of nuclear materials, INFCIRC 225 captures the international modal regulations. Revision 5 was recently issued. Provisions from INFCIRC 225 Rev 5 are summarized in the following slides, but I want to run through them fairly quickly. Again, this is just a summary of the Cat 3 requirements, Cat 2 requirements, Cat 1 requirements applied that derive from INFCIRC 225 and summarized or described in NSS 13. And again, we talked about a lot of this in Module 2C. Then, just as a specific example, Canada has specific regulations governing security during transport of radioactive materials in documents SOR 2000-209. For a license to transport Cat 1, 2, and 3 nuclear material, an application has to be submitted to the Canadian authority, and including this information. Provisions from Canada are compared with those in the United States in the second appendix. Again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the appendices, but you can see that just between the U.S. and Canada, there's a lot of variation in terms of what the requirements are.
They don't discriminate between categories 1, 2, and 3. They apply the same set of security measures for all three categories.
Right, they have a very broad approach. So, in addition to the slides, there's two appendices you can see that compares the international requirements of INFCIRC 225 Rev 5 with the NRC requirements, as well as comparing the Canadian security measures with those imposed by the NRC. Yep.
I was just going to ask the question. The hazardous materials regulations, DOT, generally permit the import of hazardous materials from Canada and allows compliance with the Canadian requirements. Does that have an effect on?
That's correct. And that's an important distinction. What we're talking about here are just the security requirements for transport of radioactive material, as opposed to the basic hazardous material regulations for transporting the material. So the requirements are virtually the same from DOT and the Canadian Transport Canada in terms of shipping paper requirements, hazmat training requirements, emergency response requirements. There's a difference there. The carrier or the shipper generally is required to have an ERAP, emergency response, and emergency response I can't remember what the A stands for, plan. They are required to have a plan that demonstrates how they would directly respond to and mitigate an event involving one of their shipments. So for example, Riva Resources Canada, Camco, work together mining out of out of the north there. They have to have a plan in place that demonstrates how those companies will respond to an accident involving their shipments with the uranium ore. It's not up to the local authorities like it is here in the U.S. That's probably the main difference, but virtually everything else is identical. Labeling, marking, placarding, all these other requirements just pertain to the hazardous material safety.
And I guess my question is are the physical protection requirements for nuclear materials, spent fuel, in the Canadian hazardous materials regulations, are they part of a separate body of work that are not covered by the DOT's permission to use the Canadian regulations?
Well, I know they are a separate body of work, similar to in the U.S. But I'm not sure I'm answering your question totally. I mean, it's a separate document. It's a separate set of requirements from just from Transport Canada's hazardous materials regulations. So I think these slides basically just summarize a lot of what we've talked about already today. The main point being that there's a graded approach for the materials, and so in addition to the graded approach based on the type and quantity of the materials, you're going to find that if you're trying to transport material internationally, you're going to have different approaches, different requirements, different levels of physical protection applied from country to country.